A titan in the field of space and international law joins us today on NatSec MTech. My friend and colleague, Professor David Koplow, will be discussing the Woomera Manual, which he co-edited. This volume is the definitive statement of space law. I'm Professor Laura Donahue, the Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Law and National Security at Georgetown Law and Director for the Center on National Security. David, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I think this program is such an exciting one.
Let's begin with the manual itself. What's the origin story?
Sure. There's manuals about air law, manuals about the law of war at sea. Probably the most successful one has been the Tallinn Manual about cyber law. The next logical step in the sequence was to try to do something about the law of outer space. And so this project grew out of that, involving experts from around the world, military officers and professors and other kinds of practitioners over a long period of time.
So one of the most interesting things to me about this manual, so it came out with a series of 9 rules, which were basically, as far as I could tell, cobbled from various agreements that are out there. I'd like to go through these rules. The first one is freedom of use, access, and exploration, as well as scientific investigation. And here, Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty basically says, consistent with the principles of cooperation, a state has the right to freely use and explore and engage in the investigation of outer space, but see, in legal jargon, the Artemis program, right? This seems like a real problem. In 2017, we have Space Directive 1, which created this program to basically establish for the United States a long-term presence on the moon and to pave the way for missions to Mars. Is Artemis a violation of international law?
Well, so let's begin at the beginning. The starting point for the Woomera Manual is to look at the extent to which the Outer Space Treaty and the others have become customary international law and therefore binding even on countries that have not joined that treaty. That was a problem, a question that we had to address in every one of the rules.
How can it be customary international law if nobody has yet established a colony on the moon where these types of issues might be worked out, that in fact it's open to all?
Sure. So you're just right that with some kinds of behaviors, it hasn't happened yet, and therefore there's no state practice to rely upon. But with respect to the principles, there has been sufficient state practice. The Artemis Accords, in contrast, at least from my view, that's non-legally binding material. That's not intended to be a treaty. And the proponents of the Artemis Accord assert that it is consistent with their obligations under the Outer Space Treaty, that they are not trying to make new law, they are not trying to depart from their prior obligations. In a couple of areas, I personally have some questions about that, about whether the behaviors anticipated on the moon or other celestial bodies really would be consistent with the obligations of the Outer Space Treaty. But at least so far, I don't see any conflict. The Artemis operations are exploring space. They are undertaking missions that are completely consistent with the behaviors that the United States and others have undertaken so far and consistent with the principles of the Outer Space Treaty.
So what are the practices that give you pause?
This is the concept that in exploiting the resources of the moon or other celestial bodies, a state or a corporation acting under authorization from a state would be legally permitted to extract resources and to claim ownership over those resources. That raises the question under the Outer Space Treaty about whether the Outer Space Treaty would permit a country to say, well, I'm not claiming sovereignty over the moon, but I can claim ownership over resources extracted from the moon, and that's different from appropriation. The participants in the Artemis Accords and many individual countries claim that would be legally allowed.
So we've moved on to Rule 2, right, which is this principle of non-appropriation that you have. On that first exertion of sovereignty, it's pretty clear. Northrop Grumman is building a railroad right now. They won the bid for the moon in order to allow us to mine resources there. I'm not sure I buy your distinction with regard to habitats that we're building. Really, that's not exerting sovereignty when you build a habitat and you land people there and they live there full time. That strikes me as an exercise in sovereignty that's going on at that point. But this mining is very much a part of the design of what we plan to do.
I'm afraid we agree. It seems to me that the question is whether it constitutes appropriation to use something, and especially to use it so intensively that as a practical matter, it excludes others from using that. Because when my satellite is on a particular trajectory at a particular time, nobody else's satellite can be on that same place at that same time. That seems to me to be within the category of allowable exploration and use. But when the pattern of use becomes long duration and widespread, excluding others from a bigger, more enduring segment, then it does raise a question of appropriation that just has not been resolved. Another illustration of that is with the Starlink satellites. Starlink has put up thousands of satellites in a particular orbital shell, and they are not claiming a right to exclusivity. But when they put up so many, as a practical matter, nobody else would dare go there. And I think there's a appropriation not by claim of sovereignty, but by use, which is also part of the article in the Outer Space Treaty, that it is becoming so extensively used that nobody else can go there. And the same, I think, would be the same framing of the issue about a permanent habitation.
So there's a parallel here with law of the sea. So, a boat traveling in the water, in some ways it's dissimilar because you can't put a boat in geosynchronous orbit, right? Like it doesn't stick in that same place in the middle of international waters forever. On the other hand, if that vessel were to land on an island and permanently inhabit all of the harbors on that island, now we're in a different world, right? Which strikes me as more analogous to what's happening with the planned colony on the moon.
I find it very difficult and unsatisfying to make direct analogies between different domains in international law. And the law of the sea, the main treaty there, is just different from the Outer Space Treaty. The Law of the Sea Convention has much more precision and specificity about what rules countries and their private vessels can engage in on the high seas.
Do we need greater specificity for outer space?
Yes, and for that, I start with the title of the Outer Space Treaty, which is that it's a title about principles governing the behavior of states in the exploration and use of outer space. The Law of the Sea Convention, in contrast, and it goes well beyond principles. It establishes the detailed rules. The world did negotiate 3 other treaties that provided some of the legal infrastructure necessary for operations in outer space. But after the 1970s, that process stopped. And therefore, we just don't have enough law in outer space. That's the fundamental defect.
I think it's fair to say also that we had decreasing levels of agreement, right, as time went on. So you have 112 parties to the Outer Space Treaty in 1967, but then with Rescue and Return, you have 99. The Liability Convention in 1972, you have 98. The Registration Convention in 1976, you have 73. And by the time we get to the Moon Agreement in 1979, we have 18 or 17 right now parties to that agreement. This is the reason we haven't seen any movement since then, because we have such disparate levels of engagement with space and capabilities in regard to space, and increasing levels of disagreement about the myriad issues and matters that relate to space law.
So I think all of that is true. There aren't that many countries that have had a sustained and broad-gauged array of activities in outer space. And for many of them, there's no particular reason to join the Liability Convention or the Registration Convention. The United States has been out in front, pulling the world toward the development of additional law. And in the intervening decades, the United States has not provided that degree of leadership, especially regarding military activities.
And we'll come back to this with the non-proliferation type issues in WMD, because here China and Russia have taken the lead, and the United States has not been out in front. What if this moon colonization and extraction of resources goes as planned? There's no derogation provision. What happens to the Outer Space Treaty if the United States does this?
So my view on this is that the Outer Space Treaty is not obsolete. There's nothing in the treaty that is wrong or too old. My view is there's just not enough of it, that there aren't enough rules. There's no existing limitation or restriction aside from the principles about non-appropriation and due regard and other avoiding potentially harmful interference. There's some vague principles that I think are still the valid principles, but they have not been fleshed out with the requisite detail.
Let's talk about the elephant in the room, SpaceX. SpaceX is going to Mars. Does the Outer Space Treaty even take account of that? That's not the US government doing it. It is a private company.
One foundational principle about outer space law is that under the Outer Space Treaty, a country is legally responsible, internationally responsible for the behaviors of its actors, its nationals in outer space. Ordinarily, you don't have a claim against the country. The rule for outer space, however, is different. A country is responsible for the space activities of its nationals. And that was an outgrowth of the debate at the time of the negotiation of the treaty, where the Soviet Union's view was that only countries should be allowed to undertake activities in outer space. So if SpaceX does something illegal or harmful in outer space, the victim, who's ever harmed by that, has a claim against Elon Musk, but also a claim against Uncle Sam, because the United States is responsible for the activities in space of its nationals.
On the other hand, if Elon Musk or SpaceX sets up a colony on Mars, not necessarily harming anybody, it's not necessarily an expression of US sovereignty, what international law would apply there? I mean, international law is a creature of state-to-state negotiations. So are we creating a modern-day equivalent of the East India Trading Company where they set up their own rules?
If SpaceX establishes a colony on the moon or on Mars or space stations, that's legally the same as if the United States government did all those things itself. And the United States government would be subject to the rules such as they are. The problem is, as I said before, there's just not enough of them. So it is not a law-free zone. It's a law-deficient zone where we don't have enough authority and enough specificity of what the rules should be.
So Rule 3 in the manual says that states engaged in exploration of outer space shall engage only in the peaceful, non-aggressive exploration and use of outer space. Rule 4 then says a state shall use the moon and other celestial bodies exclusively for peaceful purposes, so no military bases, installations, fortifications, testing of weapons, conduct of military maneuvers, etc. And then, of course, Rule 5 is no weapons of mass destruction. Can you talk a little bit about those provisions and what they detail and the relationship between bilateral and multilateral treaties like the PNTB and New START treaties? Can you talk about those relationships for just a moment?
So one starting point, and this is a peculiarity of the vocabulary that has been used, is that the treaty restricts outer space to the moon and other celestial bodies to peaceful purposes. And one question is, what does peaceful mean? This treaty does not have a definition of term. Therefore, we don't have authoritative interpretation of what these phrases are supposed to mean. One logical interpretation would be to say that the opposite of peaceful is military, and that therefore, if you can only do peaceful activities, you can't do any military activity in space. And the dominant interpretation of peaceful purposes means that the opposite of peaceful is aggressive, not military. And therefore, military activities that were non-aggressive are permitted. Before the Outer Space Treaty also has some other specific prohibitions about particular military activities on the moon and other celestial bodies, such as testing weapons and establishing military bases. But the most general prescription is that you can put military things in space for defensive purposes. And therefore, you do see a lot of military activity in space under the justification that it's done for self-defense or collective self-defense rather than aggression.
Right. So let's talk about self-defense. Last year, the U.S. put more than 2,000 satellites up. Russia put 60. Right. That's a far cry from 1984, when the USSR had 122 satellites that it launched, and the U.S. only launched 36. Russia has all the incentive in the world to actually start weaponizing space and can claim that's in self-defense. How do you distinguish between what is an act of self-defense and what is an aggressive act? Is that really always so clear, particularly in regard to new technologies are making it possible to do more and more and more in terms of space?
I'd say it's almost never so clear whether an activity is undertaken for self-defense or for aggressive purposes. That's always a difficult dividing line. I would disagree that Russia today could say it's going to fire anti-satellite weapons at satellites and claim that it's acting in self-defense. I think that would be a bridge too far for a legal claim right now. But you're just right. Circumstances change, technology changes, and the definition of self-defense is, in all domains, uh, malleable, and therefore it's an unstable regime.
Well, for that matter, let's look at the United States. What if, as a matter of preemptive self-defense, what if that were applied to a space domain?
I differentiate between anticipatory self-defense and preemptive self-defense. In order to be legitimate anticipatory self-defense, it's got to be something like the last clear chance, and where the need for action is instantaneous and overwhelming, leaving no moment for deliberation. That's the test that goes back to the famous Caroline case, where if you are perceiving that you are about to be attacked, maybe you don't have to sit there and take the first blow, and you can act first. There would be some who would say that the UN Charter changed the rules, and that the Caroline case is no longer good law under the Article 51 and Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. In my view, there is still some scope for anticipatory self-defense, but it's got to be at the last moment when there's no other opportunity for diplomatic negotiations or a peaceful reconciliation.
How do new technologies affect this calculation for you?
So, and in addition to speed, you'd have to couple with the enormous destructive power of modern technology. It means that a country could rationally calculate the last clear chance for me to blunt the anticipated attack is now, and I can't wait even another moment, because they could attack me so quickly and effectively win the war in a moment.
So just so we rest easier tonight, can you spin out a scenario in which it's instantaneous and massive?
So I don't think this is going to help anybody sleep better tonight, because these are scary scenarios and are absolutely too realistic. If country A were intent on attacking country B in a first strike, one of the first things they would do is try to blind the reconnaissance capabilities of country B, and increasingly those rely on satellite services. Therefore, the first warning country B gets that suddenly their recon satellites go dark. At that point, it's real hard for B to know what's happened, because without more information, anything else could be a benign explanation, and therefore country B would have to take into account the geopolitical circumstances at the time and make a fateful determination that it is in the process of being attacked. Country A would probably be following up very quickly with other military activities, and so the moment between satellites going dark and impacts on your territory might be very short. But in that interval, country B might decide the only thing I can do is to begin my response.
On the other hand, in a world of deep fakes and third-party hacks and capabilities, it really doesn't even have to be country A, right? It could be country C that does it. And because of the geopolitics, country B retaliates to country A, who then retaliates to country B, and it's actually country C, or cross-national, multinational organization C, or bad actor C that has inculcated that response.
Absolutely. And it could be natural causes. There are lots of meteoroids out there, and there are internal malfunctions. So there could be lots of reasons why a country in the position of state B would hesitate before undertaking a retaliation against country A. But you can also imagine situations where A and B are in a hostile mode, and the belligerent response seems plausible, even with the risk that it's been maliciously instigated by state or non-state actor C.
What are you seeing now that's the same or different about the nuclear posture of different states in terms of threat levels and the weaponization potentially of space with nuclear devices, which we haven't hitherto seen? How do we think about what we're seeing now in light of what you've seen since you started working on this in the 80s, right?
Well, so what I'd say is that the problem of nuclear weapons has always been there. But after 9/11, the United States and the world suddenly was focused on terrorism as the predominant threat. That wasn't because the nuclear threat had faded, but public attention was somewhat diverted. And now, for whatever reason, the pendulum has swung back and people are paying attention to nuclear threats again. There have been arms control treaties. There have been efforts to enhance the security of nuclear sites and to lock down nuclear materials. But the world is paying more attention today, including the recent apprehensions that Russia could be planning putting a nuclear weapon in space, which would be the first time that's happened and would generate a new kind of threat.
So if that happens, one would expect that then the United States does the same and potentially other countries as well.
Well, I sure hope that it doesn't trigger that kind of chain reaction arms race, but you're just right. There's no reason to be optimistic that we don't engage in another round of monkey see, monkey do. And there are some reasons to be particularly apprehensive about nuclear weapons in orbit. An orbiting nuclear weapon would be only a few hundred miles above the surface of the Earth. And therefore, the flight time from launching the nuclear weapon to impacting a target on Earth would be seconds. On the other hand, any satellite in orbit travels around the Earth very rapidly, and therefore it is over its potential target for only a relatively short period of time. And therefore, to have a meaningful nuclear orbiting force, you need to put several nuclear weapons on several satellites so that you always had a sufficient number of them over the opposing target. And I think most of the concepts for this would be to put them in LEO so that you take advantage of the short flight time. The current apprehension is about Russia putting a satellite. That would be tremendously bad and tremendously disruptive, but it's not something that could be done overnight.
So in the book, you divided it into this interesting approach, which is peace, tension, and war.
Yeah, certainly hope that our analysis does not give permission to countries to engage in further nefarious and belligerent activities. And the concept of dividing the rules into those three categories was mostly a way of structuring things so that you don't have to talk about everything simultaneously. And it does come at cost in terms of artificiality because some of the rules, some of the behaviors do transcend all three time periods.
Just along those lines, China and Russia object to the idea that international humanitarian law applies because if it's applying, then that means that we're engaged in some sort of sub silencio validation of the concept of war in outer space.
So we're definitely not trying to validate armed conflict in outer space, but something that might happen. And one of the conceptual decisions was how far out into the future do you want to have this manual project? You want to have some anticipation of what might happen next. But on the other hand, you don't want to look out 100 years where anything could happen. And even with that, we wanted to anticipate both a war that could start in space with satellites shooting each other, or that could start on the ground and extend into space, either by using satellite services in support of terrestrial operations, or by using terrestrial forces to shoot at satellites or using satellites to shoot down at targets on Earth. All of that could happen. Blessedly, most of that has not happened yet, but we thought that was within the range of reasonably foreseeable behaviors that should be dealt with in a manual.
And what results Rule 5 during wartime? Rule 5 being the nuclear. WMD.
Yeah. So people frequently refer to the Outer Space Treaty as creating a broad rule of no nukes in space. But in fact, it's much less ambitious than that. The Outer Space Treaty, carefully, it actually prohibits only three particular specific activities. One prohibition is on placing a nuclear weapon or other weapon of mass destruction in orbit around the Earth. Another is to station a nuclear weapon or other WMD in space. And a third is to install it on a celestial body. And the treaty doesn't define what it means by any of those activities. But we do know that some things are not prohibited. So, for example, a nuclear weapon that is launched from the Earth, goes into outer space, transits outer space for a period of time, does not achieve an orbit of the Earth, re-enters the atmosphere to attack its target. That is not prohibited by the Outer Space Treaty. The countries agree to prohibit activities that they either don't want to undertake anyway, or don't have the capability of undertaking. And during the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union both continued their development of ICBMs and SLBMs and did not want this treaty to ban that. If we can dive even further into the weeds on this, the treaty does not define orbit. Both the United States and the Soviet Union and China now have toyed with the idea that if you were going to attack your adversary, with nuclear weapons, the traditional, obvious way of doing that is to go from the United States or the Soviet Union to go north over the North Pole. But what if you did things the long way around? You launched from the continental United States southward over the South Pole and then attacked the Soviet Union from the south. The flight time would be longer, but you might be able to surprise the adversary. And then the question is, does that count as placing the nuclear weapon in orbit if it goes, say, 3/4 of the way around the Earth? Outer Space Treaty does not define what it means to put the weapon in orbit. And a physicist would say that that is an orbit, that the nuclear device has been placed into an orbital trajectory and then deorbited before it completes one complete circuit, and therefore would be prohibited by the treaty. In contrast, the lawyers and the diplomats have come up with the opposite interpretation and have said that the Outer Space Treaty is applicable only when a weapon completes at least one complete circuit of the Earth. And therefore, this fractional orbital system would not be banned by the Outer Space Treaty. Fortunately, the world has never had to confront that in practice, but it's a good illustration of a lingering problem that is established by the fact that the Outer Space Treaty is just about principles and states its prohibitions at a rather high plane without the implementing details that subsequent lawmaking could have provided.
Aren't we at a really vulnerable moment in terms of our negotiations with Russia in particular on nuclear weapons with the end of New START and nothing kind of in the hopper coming forward? How do we think about the broader nuclear conversation with space as one aspect of it?
These are very perilous times. As long as the fighting is continuing in Ukraine, I think it's highly unlikely that we could reach any productive agreements or that the U.S. Senate would provide 2/3 vote of advice and consent to anything meaningful. But things can change, and things can change rapidly. And we should have the intellectual infrastructure in place to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. There have been times throughout the Cold War where the greatest progress in arms control was able to be achieved only shortly after some of the darkest days. The best example of that is the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty that banned nuclear explosions in the atmosphere, at outer space, and underwater. That was concluded in 1963, only about 10 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was probably the closest the United States and the Soviet Union came to warfare that could have destroyed the Earth. And less than a year later, they were able to conclude the first major milestone in arms control. Maybe seismic shifts could enable not just the United States and Russia, but China as well, to make progress on nuclear arms control or outer space arms control or other opportunities as well.
On the other hand, if we lack a broader arms control framework, then new capabilities will be developed, which could easily be deployed, right, in a space context as well. So it seems that we might see rapid expansion in terms of capabilities.
I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, the metaphor I don't like is that sometimes arms control is likened to squeezing a balloon. That is, if you get constraints on one part of the balloon, you haven't really made the balloon any smaller. It just flows in some other direction. And in order to really achieve meaningful security advantages, you've got to have a much more ambitious, more comprehensive approach. As a political matter, achieving a globally authoritarian, completely comprehensive regime is almost impossible. The move now is to find some way of getting the process started again.
So setting nuclear to one side, has the horse already left the barn in terms of the weaponization of space? We see all sorts of ways in which devices have been put up with offensive or aggressive. And yet in 2008, and then again in 2014, China and Russia came forward to try to introduce at the UN a treaty to alleviate the likelihood of increasing weaponization of space. The United States stood against those efforts. Why the United States opposed that, and whether there are efforts afoot that might be able to make some progress in those areas.
So Russia and China have for a long time sponsored this program that's sometimes referred to as PPWT, a treaty on the prohibition of the placement of weapons in space. And their draft is not a good treaty. It is defective in many ways, including the lack of mechanisms for verification of compliance. How would you know that a country has or has not placed a weapon in space. One of the difficulties is that once a satellite is up there, it's difficult to inspect it. It's difficult to know its contents, activities it might be capable of. And to do pre-launch inspection would be a great intrusion on national security of the launching country. So the problem with all of space arms control is verification of compliance. How would you know that the other side is living up to its obligation? And in my view, the United States is right to reject that approach. But for me, the United States should take some leadership and propose something that would be more effective and more satisfactory. You can't beat something with nothing. And the United States has so far not come forward with better alternatives.
What happens when we start talking about Star Wars and create U.S. Spacecom trying to plan for what you seem to view as somewhat an inevitable future?
So one additional dimension of weapons in space that might be a suitable bridge is the possibility of using a nuclear explosive device as a mechanism to divert an incoming asteroid. Depending on the size of the asteroid and the composition, it could be a planet killer. And the world does not have an adequate response mechanism. So in that situation, some people have speculated about the possibility that one mechanism might be to put a nuclear explosive device on a spaceship and send it to intercept the asteroid and detonate there, either to fracture the asteroid or to divert its path. Nothing of that sort has ever been tried, but it has at least been exposed in a wide array of cheesy Hollywood movies where Bruce Willis or Robert Duvall or some other action hero flies up there and uses the nuclear explosive device to destroy the asteroid. Well, I got to say, parenthetically, if a movie has Bruce Willis in it, it's probably not a documentary. And that's not the way that NASA scientists would actually undertake such a mission. International law stands in the way. That the Outer Space Treaty prohibits installing a nuclear explosive device on a celestial body, such as an asteroid. The Limited Test Ban Treaty prohibits nuclear explosions in outer space. You need to find some mechanism for reconciling the need for the planet to defend itself against an asteroid with our fidelity to foundational international law that's been in place for many, many countries for many, many years, has proven essential to restrain the nuclear arms race here on the planet.
My understanding was NASA had tried something like this just by driving a satellite really hard at an asteroid, and it worked.
So that's right. There was the DART mission where NASA fired a small spacecraft at a small asteroid, and that was an enormous success to have really an autonomously piloted spacecraft going millions and millions of miles and hit the satellite, the asteroid square on. And that gives hope that the technology could find an answer for this. But that was a small asteroid. And in order to deflect a bigger asteroid, that impactor is not going to be sufficient. And that's one where you had plenty of advance notice about the asteroid. And asteroids are of all different characters, so that some, for example, are a solid intact body like that one, but many asteroids are more like a collection of rubble that's loosely held together by its own gravity. And so an impactor is going to hit some of the rubble, but not all of it. Scientists have been trying to come up with alternative technologies, all of which exist only on the drawing board. It might be that only a nuclear explosive would have the energy levels necessary to have an impact.
Excellent. Okay, Rule 6 moves to intelligence, and it basically says military space activities for the purpose of collecting intelligence from, to, and within space are not prohibited unless the specific means or methods of collection violate applicable international obligation. What that exactly means, does that mean imagery, so photographs, infrared, synthetic aperture radar, all electronic signals, space situational awareness systems, all of these are perfectly legitimate and can collect signals from other satellites and interfere the data transfer or possibly even the manipulation of data on space vessels themselves?
My view, and I think the
You
manual,
weren't very neutral.
the manual's view is that data collection is essentially unlimited. And that in part stems from the foundational principle of international law established in the Lotus case, where in general, a country is free to do whatever it wants to do unless it has agreed to a rule that restrains that. And in outer space, the rule has been quite permissive with regard to data collection, whether it's by visual or infrared or SIGINT or any other mechanism. One of the dramatic things about the first Sputnik flights is that the world welcomed the idea that humanity was now venturing into outer space. Instead of that, if people had realized what they were tolerating, they might not have agreed to such a permissive regime. And so now, if a country wants to gather any kind of intel, that's unrestrained. Manipulating the data is a different category, but the collection of data, I think, is unlimited.
So let's talk about biometrics. If we wanted to put up a collection mechanism and collect the biometrics of every single person who appears in public in another country, including the United States, are there any prohibitions under international law from doing so?
I don't see it.
What about domestic law? Under Open Fields Doctrine, Hester, 1924, Hester opinion issued by Justice Holmes at the time, where he completely ignores the fact that federal agents were trespassing on the land, went into the house without a warrant, actually searched all of the individuals present. However, for more than 100 years, Open Fields Doctrine has dominated, even in the post-Katz world. So if the United States wanted to collect the biometric data of individuals from outer space and ostensibly monitor it, does Carpenter apply?
I'm afraid that you have put your finger on a real gap in both international and domestic law, where modern technology has so far outstripped our notions of what is a reasonable expectation of privacy, and where the advance of technology shrinks everybody's expectation. Now we have much greater capabilities for penetrating what people had thought of as being a barrier against outside snooping. And international law is not going to be the cutting edge to restrain that. I'm not sure that domestic law is up to that challenge yet either.
So if as a domestic matter, the government wanted to put up on a satellite biometric reading technologies where we could identify individuals and focus it on particular cities or areas or religious institutions, could it do so?
That's still to be determined, and that part of it would depend on context. If it's undertaking gathering of evidence for a criminal prosecution, that'd be more restrained than a corporation seeking to sell you something. I think under existing law, it's tough to see restraints on that.
How would that be constrained even under criminal law? It's from space.
The evidence would be sought to be introduced in the court and would be challenged as being a violation of reasonable expectation of privacy.
So it's hard to argue that if you have no privacy interest in a helicopter hovering over your home, you have a privacy interest in Leo.
So it would be, can they see through the roof of the house? That would test the limits of those earlier cases.
Yeah.
And now we can do that.
Can any country do that then? Under international law, according to the Woomera Manual, the way I read it, yeah, they can do that.
Well,
there is no international legal regime that would limit that.
Absolutely right. And no part of the legal regime that says the United States can do things that others cannot do. So whatever autonomy or authority one country has, the others would definitely have as well.
As an asterisk, I would assume that European countries actually would be under a slightly different regime because of European law, right? Which actually has in their charter protections for the privacies of, intimate relationships and so on are incorporated. But there's a national security exception. And that's only vis-a-vis European citizens, not vis-a-vis the rest of the world in terms of the citizen.
And I think that's a part of how the privacy law is evolving in different ways in different regions around the world. And it could be that the expectation of privacy for young people in the United States today is remote, that they are freely exposing so many aspects of their lives that in previous generations would have been thought to be proprietary, and they seem untroubled.
Okay, so let's turn to, so the rule 7 is that states retain jurisdiction over space objects as well as nationals. We've already explored this question of sovereignty, though. You have no sovereignty, so how do you retain jurisdiction when you have individuals operating you can have a company that, and maybe I should take this along with Rule 8, which is you have to register your vessels. What happens if it's a U.S. company that launches from New Zealand using a European spacecraft? Whoever registers it then ostensibly retains some level of responsibility for what happens. But it's not clear to me that that system necessarily encompasses the increasing role of the private sector in the commercialization of space.
So this is one of the more complicated areas of international law, where the law of outer space is just different from other domains. For example, a ship has a nationality. A ship gets registered on the registry of a particular country. A satellite is registered, but the satellite itself does not have nationality. The satellite is not considered to be a person the way a ship is considered in maritime law. And the affiliations that a satellite might have with one or more countries can be multiple. So ordinarily, there would be one country that registers a satellite. There can be multiple countries that count as a launching state for a particular satellite. And procuring, that's an activity that's undertaken by multiple corporations from multiple countries. And once you are the launching state, you are the launching state forever. Even if you have an ownership interest in the satellite and you sell your ownership interest, you are still the launching state. And the launching state has certain responsibilities under international law. But as a jurisdictional matter, the rule established in the Outer Space Treaty and the others is that the ownership interest does not disappear just because something is put up in outer space. So it's still owned by you. It's still your property. And therefore, you're responsible for it if it crashes into somebody else's satellite.
We haven't really gotten into the details of the law yet. That the Outer Space Treaty are just broad principles, completely underdeveloped area of the law. So in some sense, the Woomera Manual is the prequel, right? It's the prequel to actually getting into law that can govern this area. We now have 88 states that have satellites in outer space. There are going to be more with vessels, with spacecraft, etc. So along these lines, with the Rule 9, this persistent ownership concept, we now have space debris, right? All these satellites that are floating around. How do the old principles somewhat undermine our ability to deal with the current reality?
I think you're just right. We are at a transition point where the human behavior in outer space is increasing so rapidly that the current underdeveloped state of the law will not be tolerable for very much longer, and we will need additional increments of infrastructure. And just as one example of that is debris. The Liability Convention establishes a remarkable or two categories of tort rule. Differs whether my piece of debris or my satellite causes damage in space or on the ground. If my satellite crashes into your satellite, then I am liable under the Liability Convention if I have been at fault. In contrast, if my satellite crashes to Earth and causes damage on the ground, I have absolute liability for that. Space is an ultra-hazardous activity, and therefore I should have duty to compensate who's ever victimized on the ground by my activities. There's been one illustration of that. There was one time when a Soviet satellite crashed into northwest Canada. It happened that it was a nuclear-powered satellite, and so it spread radioactivity over hundreds of kilometers of northwest Canada, and Russia had liability to pay for the cleanup costs. That's the only experience the world has in finding a liability solution to the problem of debris. But we're going to need a lot more than that, because some regions of Earth orbit, especially in the popular low Earth orbit altitudes, have become so crowded that it may impede future use. It may be that we have so fouled our nest that important, valuable regions of space become unusable. The phenomenon that is sometimes described is the Kessler syndrome, named after a NASA scientist who contemplated that at some point the population of debris would become so dense that one piece of debris crashes into another, causes them both to fragment. Those fragments spread out and they collide with other pieces of debris and create an unending chain reaction that creates so much debris that the region is just uninhabitable. And we may be close to that now. We may be to the point where those kinds of collisions are unavoidable and the world has no mechanism for cleaning it up. At the moment, there is no capability that's been tried and tested for removing even large pieces. Even a small piece of debris could be fatal to a collision with a satellite, and there's just no capability of even monitoring, let alone cleaning up that cloud of debris. We need to have some responsibility for countries to clean up after themselves.
Okay, well, in an effort to turn this a little bit more to the optimistic side, because we've covered a lot of some of the parade of horribles, or we're nowhere near actually setting up a legal regime in any sort of effective way. Where is there hope?
Well, where I feel most hopeful is not the legal regime, it's the human endeavors that people are now turning to space more. And my hope is that the law will follow that. Countries, not just the United States, but other countries as well, are seeing enormous value in space. I have my own grievances against the density of the Starlink constellation, but it's an illustration of enormous value that can be gained from operations in outer space and the NASA programs on exploration of outer space, the James Webb Telescope, the others following in that tradition. Just enormous, just inspiring. It's just wonderful what value humanity has been able to extract from space, and that should not stop. So the hope is that the legal regime will enable and safeguard those kinds of activities.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been wonderful to have you and to learn so much about how these events are unfolding. So thank you so much. It's been great having you, David.
And it's a great pleasure to be working with you on this.
Professor Koplow routinely publishes scholarly articles. His latest, Pave Outer Space and Put Up a Parking Lot, Lagrange Points Should Be the Common Heritage of Mankind, is available to read in the Michigan Journal of International Law. See our website for links to some of his other work. My thanks to David once again for joining our program.